We can pick up differences in movement like 4 or 5 months prior to death, but then it's the last several weeks where their body condition, where they outwardly look sick to us.
What is up, everybody? Mark on the mic here, joined by Mr. Dan Storm, PhD, deer research scientist with the Wisconsin DNR. Dan, you've been on the podcast before. Welcome back.
Thank you.
It's always great to have you here. Similar topic today, maybe with a little bit more info. We're going to be talking about the Southwest Wisconsin deer and predator study, which is recently or fairly recently wrapped up.
Yep, that's right. And we're still analyzing data, and we'll be analyzing data for a while now. But yeah, we've got the major results, are wrapped up, and happy to start presenting those.
Yeah. I mean, you guys did a lot of work here, multi-year study. We'll get into some of the specifics. Learned a lot, like you said. Have more to learn. And man, this is something that I've been awaiting the results on. Extremely interested in, and also, I think what you guys will learn and get out of it, this isn't a Wisconsin thing. This is a CWD thing. And so I think, if you're out there and you're like, oh, I don't live in Wisconsin, this doesn't really affect me. Well, number one, CWD is in a lot of states now.
Yeah.
And I want, if we can get some specifics on that later, I'd love to do that as well. And so this information should be, if you care about deer, if you care about, if you're a hunter, probably information that's relevant to you, your passions, and the animals that you care about.
Yeah, absolutely. Now CWD has been detected in every Midwestern state. There's very few states now that haven't had it detected. I couldn't tell you the full list of what has and hasn't, but it's an issue that, it's not an issue that's going away or shrinking. It's an issue that's growing and becoming more and more relevant for more and more hunters, for sure.
Where was it first discovered?
It was first discovered like in Colorado.
Okay, that's what I thought.
This was back in the 60s.
What I didn't know was it was that long ago.
Yeah, and for the longest time, it took them, I think, if I'm remembering my sort of history of it right, I think it took them maybe more than a decade to even understand, oh, this is a prion, like even what it was, right? It took them a long time and was the basis of a lot of research to figure out what the heck was even going on. But that was in the 60s back in Colorado, and it had been in the wild in Colorado and Wyoming for a while, and then spreading and discovered in South Dakota, Nebraska for a while, and then it was a deer shot in 2001 in Wisconsin. That's when we discovered it in Wisconsin. At the same time, they discovered it in northeastern Illinois as well.
Gotcha.
And we were the first outside of the West.
Okay.
Yeah, we were the first east of the Great Plains, basically, to have it.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to back up for 1 second, but then I want to return to Wisconsin. So before we get too far along, and I know we did cover some in the last podcast, but what is CWD?
Oh, sure. So chronic wasting disease it's a disease that's caused by, it's a transmissible disease, meaning it can spread, and it's caused by a prion, which is basically, there's these proteins that we all mammals at least have, that have some functions for our bodies, right? And the thing with these proteins is they somehow get misfolded. So somehow their structure gets changed, and the change of the structure causes them, that somehow causes the neighboring prions to also change their structure, but then it causes them to not get degraded. So a normal of those proteins would have some kind of life cycle. They get synthesized, made, and then they get destroyed and so on. That's just like the normal life cycle of those proteins. But the misfolding of it causes it so that it doesn't get degraded. And so it just accumulates into what they call these plaques, which eventually start disrupting. And this is occurring in the neurological tissue where it causes issues, like in the brain, right? And eventually that starts to cause, you're disrupting the brain. That's a problem, right? So
Right.
eventually that causes just a cascade of problems within the body, leading eventually to death. And that takes a long time. It could take 18 months for the prions to accumulate within the body. But then what they'll see when they have a deer that's reached what we call end stage, meaning the CWD, the disease has run its course in that individual deer and has caused that deer to die, what they'll see is essentially like little holes in the brain. And that's just what occurs with this accumulation of prions that can't be degraded. That's what happens. So it's not a virus or a bacteria or a protozoa. It's not anything. It's very dissimilar from the diseases that we're really used to. Although there are other examples. There's mad cow, bovine transmissible encephalopathy. Encephalopathy means brain disease. And then there's a disease in sheep that's quite similar to CWD called scrapie. That operates pretty similarly to CWD apparently, in that it's transmissible between individuals, whereas the mad cow disease wasn't. Like cows weren't giving it to each other through like contact, but through the agricultural processes, like they would actually be consuming cow stuff. Anyway,
right.
That's how that. And then there's what in humans there's Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease.
Nice.
Which and there's different forms of that apparently, but that's more seen as like a spontaneous or genetically inherited disease. But the same sort of processes operate in the brain there.
One thing you mentioned, you talked about the prions of CWD, kind of becoming like a plaque and accumulating. But it's interesting to me that you've got this accumulation, but it's presenting as holes in the brain.
Yeah, and I don't exactly know how that works. If that's like I'm not sure how that leads to that. But it basically it's like disrupting. I mean, you think of it. There's all the neurons in the brain. They're connecting, and you're disrupting those connections in some manner, and that's what's causing the problems. But yeah, I don't know how that leads to the actual what they call like vacuoles or whatever, which are these holes, these little pockets of nothing.
And these other things that are similar, I guess, in some ways, like scrapie, are they prions as well?
Yeah, that's
okay.
all. Those are the diseases that are prion diseases.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's one in mink as well. So there are some other similar diseases, but I guess my point was like it's not like a virus at all. It's not. Yeah, and it's not even an organism. Bacteria is its own species. This isn't that. It's just a very bizarre pathogen for sure.
And then, like you said, they're not necessarily breaking down. So, do we know like what is like when CWD is in an animal or on the landscape, right? I mean, it's going to go somewhere, right? A deer dies with CWD. There it is. That prion is going somewhere after that, right? If it's not disappearing or dying, how long does it stay there
in the environment?
Yeah,
we don't know, and it's not to say it's indestructible. It's very difficult. Like cooking it. That sort of levels of temperature are not enough to destroy that or render it uninfectious. That doesn't happen, but. Well, I should back up too and say, like as you said, like an infected deer has prions, and it has them throughout their body. It's in highest concentrations in the brain and the spinal cord and stuff. But so a deer dies. The prions are now in the environment to some extent, but also urine and feces, saliva. They have prions as well. So the prions are getting into the environment that way. So and then. It has been demonstrated as well that, in these captive situations that animals can get infected from the environment. So they have animals they know did not have the disease. They put them in an empty pen, a pen that previously had CWD positive deer in it, but no longer. and then those deer that don't have the disease, then they get it. So then we knew that they can get that disease from the environment. All right, because so the prions shed in the environment and then are to some extent available for other deer. So there's transmission pathways potentially. Okay, so back to your question, you asked how long they last, and we don't know, but they aren't indestructible. There are, there's going to be, the weathering processes in nature, whether it's the microbial activity, because the soil is full of all kinds of microbes and they're doing their thing. Does that degrade prions? Probably at some level. Just the weathering, the changes in temperature and the heat, or in dryness and water, that all at some level probably degrades prions. And then if you think too about the forest floor, and you think about, okay, some deer drools, and then it's going to get covered by leaves and whatever else. So it's not as though every prion that goes into the environment is just available to transmit new deer forever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How long? I mean, we don't know. We just don't know that. And what are exactly the factors, and how quickly does this factor degrade versus that factor? It's hard to say. But things like bleach, I mean, this isn't applicable to environmental contamination, but bleach and some other cleaning compounds can effectively denature the prion. So that's, there are things like that, especially if you're thinking about kind of totally shifting gears to like your hunting applications and stuff. But at any rate, so the point there is they're not, because there's this idea, well, it goes in the environment, so then we can never do anything about it, just forget about it. But the point is, there's got to be some diminishment over time. So you just don't want to keep adding to it, because it's probably just not going to last forever unless we keep adding to the environment forever, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I liked that example of the forest floor, you've got leaf litter covering it up. If at some point it's covered up and they don't have necessarily access to it,
right,
then maybe we just need a lot of dirt. Is that what we need?
We need to start shoveling, yeah. And there's things that reminds me. I mean, there's so it's in the environment. Well, how do they get it? In that sort of pen situation, they're confined and they're sort of, in a sense, forced to interact with their environment in a way that would lead to that. So how does that happen in the wild? And again, it could be, well, if they're feeding, they're eating waste grain and there's poop and maybe they accidentally ingest some poop. That'd be one way. Another way, and you could just imagine a number of different ways, but one way would be through scrapes, the ground scrapes. And I think probably a lot of your listeners are aware, but if you're not, one of the ways that white-tailed deer communicate to one another is through the use of what we call a ground scrape. So typically there'll be a low-hanging branch, we call a licking branch, and the deer will go to that and they'll kind of nibble on it or rub their glands, preorbital glands, and their on their head, their forehead, lick on it, chew on it, and then on the ground they'll paw at the ground to basically get down to the dirt, and then they'll often urinate on it, and they'll urinate on their tarsal glands, and it's a scent communication signpost sort of thing, right? It's most prominent in bucks, but all deer do it. It's most prominent, and you see them if you're a deer hunter, if you're a whitetail hunter, oh, the scrape's opened up. It's it always happens.
I mean, that's one of the things we are looking for.
Exactly. It's hunters really, whitetail hunters, especially bow hunters, really key in on that. They really open up in a big way in October, but there are these, especially call them community scrapes. These because a scrape, I should say, a scrape could be one buck comes along, yearling buck, he makes a scrape and never comes back, and no other deer ever visits it. But then there's these community scrapes, and I think a lot of, especially if you're a landowner in whitetail country or you're an avid bow hunter, you'll see those and probably set up your hunting around them to some extent, where it's every year. This is the little oak tree, and they're going to go back every year, and you can see it's scrape is half the size of this table, and it's that way every year, and that's a place where the community will go to. So how does that connect to prions? I mean,
it's kind of it's their social media.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's Bob was here or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, and it's advertising readiness to mate, I suppose. And it's like, who's there? And yeah, so it's definitely a communication hub for deer, but based on what they're doing, chewing on a branch, licking a branch, peeing on the ground, digging up the ground, they might ingest some of that soil. It's it makes sense that that's a one way that, like a particular spot rather than just like any random spot in the forest or the land that the deer would pee or drool on. It's a spot. And there's been some researchers that at Mississippi State, at UW, who have gone, UW-Madison, that have gone and taken dirt from a scrape and tested it for CWD prions, the presence of prions, and then they'll find that. They'll find prions, so which they sure should in an area where there's a lot of CWD infected deer. But anyhow, that's sort of one of the notions about how it might spread environmentally.
I've heard, and I don't know if it's true, that plants can uptake these prions.
Yeah. That's been discovered, yeah.
So would that be another way a deer eats some some soybeans, and then boom, now I've got it?
Possibly, yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know, and I'm not saying it hasn't or has. I don't know. I know it's been done like in a lab setting. I don't recall whether, say, surveys of, like you say, a bean field or a clover field have been done, and like they did it, clipped it out in the field, and then found prions. I'm not sure if that's happened yet or not, but okay. I know it's been demonstrated in a laboratory setting where they knew it was happening, and so then they can test like different parts of the plant and stuff like that. But that's certainly another way. But then how? Yeah. So like, but like, okay, so you have like a soybean field. Prions go in there. Maybe it's taken up by a plant. Is it eaten? Is it enough of a dose? Don't know. What about the next year? It's just hard to say how it all cashes out. Whatever's happening in the environment is obviously adequate transmission for prevalence to be doing what it's doing. Well, I just don't know exactly how. Yeah.
And speaking of prevalence and bringing it back to Wisconsin, we talked about, it was discovered in Colorado, in 1960, I think you said that was?
In the 60s.
Yeah. In Wisconsin, particularly kind of where we're at here right now in this southern region, high prevalence. What led to such a rapid transmission rate to why we are where we're at right now?
Yeah.
It just seems like you should have been seeing that other places before here even, right? And then we just kind of had a boom.
Well, what we don't know is how it got here exactly. And if you imagine like sparks going across an area. In some areas, that spark is landing on a spot with a lot of dry pine needles. In another spot, it's landing on a spot with dirt. In another spot, it's a few pine needles. They're not all going to have a chance. Not every spark's going to have a chance to take off. Some sparks are going to take off in a big way. So and I'm not saying this is what happened, but let's just imagine one possible way for CWD to have came to Wisconsin is, say, hunters go to Colorado and Wyoming, and they bring their deer back, and maybe the carcass goes in the back 40, and maybe that's how. I'm not saying that's what happened, but it could have happened. Well, that could be happening all over the country, right? But maybe it just didn't take off in these other places, and it just partly through chance, partly through there's a lot of dry needles at the place where that spark landed, because southern Wisconsin, that's amazing deer habitat. It's had a lot of deer for a while when, like in the 2000s and the 90s. I mean, there's a ton of deer in Southwest Wisconsin, a ton of deer where CWD was discovered. So that was probably really favorable conditions for disease to take off. So let's say the same, again, if just theoretically some infected mule deer buck gets tossed in the back 40 in a place where there's just way fewer deer, the chances are just less likely for it to take off. Not that it couldn't or not that it wouldn't, but but just the sheer fact of this being a deer factory, or having been a deer factory and just having so many deer, I think was probably a big reason why it took off.
Dan, I am gonna say, I know you're talking about this as a hypothetical scenario. I'm just gonna run with it though, because it gives me another thing to blame out-of-state hunters for.
Sure. Why not? But yeah, I mean, again, we will never know. I don't think we'll ever, right? And we'll never know. And whatever happened, like whatever behaviors were leading to the introduction of CWD was based on just not knowing. So you can't, even if we knew, it wouldn't be like blame, because it was based out of the level of knowledge that we had at the time. So whatever, it's done, it's happened. Yeah. So then for a long time after the discovery, the prevalence was pretty low. And that's partly that's how a disease like CWD works. It's not rabies or the flu or some of these diseases that, like a flu will go through in a season. Like no one will be infected, dang near everyone will get infected, and then it goes away because it transmits so fast. CWD doesn't transmit nearly as fast as those diseases. It's like a slow. If you looked at the curve like of cases of flu, it goes like this, and then it goes like that. And with CWD, it's much slower just by the nature of it having lower transmission rates. That's part of it. But part of it too is when the disease was discovered, there was really concerted management for a while. There was some sharpshooting, government sharpshooting, not a ton, but in the big one was that we had effective regulations at the time to really increase antlerless harvest, earn a buck, and an early October firearm season, and that effectively increased harvest of antlerless deer dramatically, and it probably had some, especially in some areas, had the effect of lowering the deer population to some extent. And so probably in some areas a lot, if there was a lot of hunters. In some areas, if there wasn't a lot of hunters, not as much. But in aggregate, had an effect of controlling, if not reducing, the deer population. Certainly increasing the rate at which deer were getting killed and removed from the landscape. So that almost certainly had some effect. It didn't cause CWD to go away, obviously, but it probably slowed the growth of that. And not to rehash all that, but we don't have earn a buck anymore. That's not in our toolbox. We don't have early rifle seasons anymore either. After that ended, because the legislature passed a bill to ban the use of earn a buck, right? After that happened, our antlerless harvests went down, our deer population increased, and then then at that point is when prevalence really rapidly increased. So there's, how much of that is cause and effect, people can argue about that, but that's the sequence of events that occurred. And so then we had this phase of prevalence really increasing at a really fast rate to get to the point where we are in the last several years. In our highest prevalence areas in Wisconsin, the prevalence has appeared to kind of level off, if not even decline a little bit in some areas. Well,
that's actually more positive than I would have anticipated, at least for right now.
Somewhat, but it can't go to 100%. Like it could never do that.
Yeah,
because every year you're getting a bunch of, because deer are pretty much born uninfected. So every year there's a pulse of non-infected deer coming through, and then they have to get exposed and become infected and stuff. And so you'll never get, so it's always about like, well, what is the prevalence you might expect? And it's hard to say it, but it seems to be the case that at least for now that we've seen the prevalence rates at the highest as we're going to see them, at least under the conditions that we've experienced. Things could change, I suppose, but the prevalence that we're seeing in some areas in females, in the 30%, in 50% in bucks in some areas, and it appears that it's not going higher than that. So there's always the prevalence rate, which is prevalence is another fancy way of sort of saying like the percentage that are positive. Whatever that rate is a function of the transmission rate, like how quickly are deer getting infected, and then how quickly are the infected deer dying, and how quickly uninfected deer are getting added to the population. So it's like there's a bunch of these flows and stuff that are all interacting that determine like the ultimate prevalence rate that is reached. So it's just the interplay of those things.
Gotcha. If a doe has CWD, and maybe it's earlier on in the process, I guess, if you will, if she drops a fawn, will that fawn be born with CWD?
Almost certainly not. I don't want to say 100% never, but no, usually no.
That's kind of shocking.
There's
to me,
like some
we're talking about
placental
sharing fluids, you know.
Yeah, but there's some like barrier. I don't know. That's more the, and I think that does happen with I think a lot of diseases where there is some placental barrier. That's not the right term. There's some barrier to that prevents the offspring to get it in the womb. Now,
that said, though,
when
she's
they're
going to
born,
interact with that.
Yeah. So then the deer's born. Now, and so her risk. So if a deer's mother has CWD, obviously that the risk of that deer getting CWD is also like way higher, right? But it may not even be 100%. I don't know how, but it seems like some deer may escape that. But then their risk, because they're always interacting. You know what? Imagine a doe fawn group. You've seen them all the time. They're always like licking each other and stuff like that. So, and they're eating the same places. And so, that's definitely not necessarily a total death sentence, but a high likelihood that if her offspring will get infected. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, let's get into the study itself a little bit. I know we've talked about a lot of stuff that intertwines with the study, but what was the study, and what were you looking for, and why were you looking for those things? Yeah,
sure. So, we've had this situation with CWD in Wisconsin where it's become highly prevalent. It's continuing to spread. That leads to the natural question of, well, what does that mean for a deer herd? So we were getting asked that a lot by hunters, especially. What does this mean for our deer populations? And, is this killing deer? Is it, reducing is it going to, or is it reducing how many deer we have? So that was the basis of the research. Let's find out, okay, with our levels of CWD that we have, is that going to impact their population growth rates? Like how many more deer get, the population growth is like how many are born, how many die. If more are born than die, your population goes up. If more die than are born, your population goes down. So that's what you're trying to figure out. And so that led us to, okay, well, that's the question what is the impact of chronic wasting disease on deer survival and population change? And so to do that, that's why we initiated the study. And then so that's led us to like our study design, which is let's collar a bunch of deer and basically find out their fates. How quickly do they die, and what do they die of? And crucially, how do those differ between deer that have CWD and deer that don't have CWD? So, and I can go into the whole data collection and stuff if you want, but that's the why. That's the why is like, well, what does this mean? We got CWD. It's everywhere. It's 30% prevalence. So what does that mean for a deer herd? What does that mean for my hunting? Well, what's it going to mean in the future? That's the why of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Gotcha. How did you guys go about doing that research then?
Yeah. So, obviously we centered that field work where we had, where we initially discovered CWD, basically our core CWD, and mostly in Iowa, northern Iowa County in Southwest Wisconsin. Actually, right, just, catching deer down the road from here.
Right.
In Barneville. And so the how we did it is you want to know survival. And so the best way to get survival is to actually take a sample of individuals and literally find out what happens to them. So what we did was we got permission on hundreds of private properties, because Southwest Wisconsin is nearly all private property. So we got a lot of great permissions from private landowners to let us go on their land to trap deer. And that's a wintertime activity because you can effectively bait them. So we catch deer. There's a variety of ways. There's a big drop net where we suspend a net in the air, drop it on them. They get tangled up. There are these, what we call like a netted cage trap, which is like a metal frame with net sides, and they go in there and they get caught. And in either case, we're going to manually kind of restrain the deer, and then we inject the deer with a chemical immobilizing drug, and then we get to work on the handling. The principal thing is collaring them, and so we've got, this is a collar, this is a GPS collar for a doe. This is the antennas on the top and the batteries on the bottom, and if you can see, like, it's a little dirty. It's got some stuff on there. And
yes, these are authentic collars.
Yeah, this was on a doe for a while, and then whenever she died, we got it back. And this is the same thing for a buck. And the difference in the collars being, there's the antenna is up here in the doe collar, but it's embedded in the bottom piece on the buck collar, because this has got a stretch, and within that there's actually folds sewn in it. And the idea is that it can grow with the buck, especially with the rut. So when the rut occurs, then this collar can expand along with the buck's as its neck grows, and then contract as the neck kind of shrinks again after the rut. But yeah, so you collar them. And let's see, the other stuff we do, we would age the deer. So you can use tooth wear and replacement, but if we knew it was at least 2 years old, then we would pull this small canine, which gets sent in for cementum annuli, which is like the tree rings kind of counting age. And and I should say too, we're always being careful with our animal care. So these deer are getting supplemental oxygen. They're sedated. Obviously, we're putting Novocaine or lidocaine in the jaw or in the tooth as a pain, suppressant. We're always monitoring their vitals throughout the whole time. So we're doing that, putting the collar on, putting ear tags on, getting a tiny little ear punch for genetic testing, and then we're getting a biopsy that allows us to test for CWD. So there's lymph tissue, like the lymph nodes. That's what the DNR will take you to the lymph nodes for your CWD testing. Well, we can't take the lymph nodes, the retropharyngeal lymph nodes, out of a live deer, but there's other lymph tissue that we can access. It happens to be in the rectum. So there's these really small rectal follicles, and we can take just a really small piece of tissue out of that without any problem. No complications to the deer. It heals really fast. But anyway, that little piece of tissue goes to the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, and they test it for CWD. So now you've got these deer, okay, and then you let it go, and it goes back and lives its life, and then eventually dies its death. So you figure out how long post-collaring did it live, and when did it die, and how did it die, and again, did it have CWD or not? And then we'll test the deer at death as well, right? Because you could test the deer at capture and it didn't have CWD, and then at some intervening moment it got CWD, and then it could die with CWD. So that's why we always get a post-mortem after death test as well.
So were you collaring some deer that you tested and you're like, yep, that deer had CWD?
Well, yes, but we don't know it immediately. It would be like, well, we caught it, and then some matter of weeks or a month later, we'll get the report, and okay, that deer was positive, that deer was positive, that deer was positive, and that deer was negative, that deer was negative. But again, we're always going to try to test it when it's dead too. Yeah, but yeah. So then you have essentially these two groups of deer that you can compare their survival rates, and that was the basis of the study. And it takes a lot of fancy statistical modeling to make all that work. But yeah, that's what we've been working through, and yeah, so that's the approach of how to collect deer. Oh, and a part of this too, I should say, because I got this fawn collar as well.
That's what I was going to jump into next, because I know you guys captured a lot of
fawns
as well.
And you helped us, right? You guys came out with us that one time, and because so we're primarily interested in how CWD affects survival, which especially female survival, because that's really what drives the population. But a part of a population is also how many deer are you adding to the population every year. That's what we call recruitment. And so that has a function of recruitment, like how many new deer do you add every year is a function of like their pregnancy rates and their litter sizes. You know, do they have twins and singletons and triplets, et cetera? And then how what's the fawn survival? And so that's why we did the fawn survival bit. And so then the fawn survival, we're trying to catch newborn fawns, and this is the collar that we have, and it's got these folds, a bunch of folds sewn into it, which is similar to the buck. The buck's kind of modeled after the fawn design, but it's got these folds sewn into it. I'm not recreating it well because of this, and then so they'll pop as the fawn grows.
Gotcha.
And then this is all elastic, and then the final stitch just makes the collar fall off. But this can grow, especially for a doe, it can grow to like basically the size of a doe's neck. But anyway, this allows us to track. This allows us to determine if a fawn is, when the fawn died. What's different about the GPS collars, which is...
What would happen if the fawn didn't die, and, I mean, I guess maybe potentially the fawn collar got big enough and it just popped off? Would you guys go recover it then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, unless... Yes. That's almost always what would happen. Once in a while, the battery will die.
Okay.
In which case, we'll just lose it. One day we go out to listen for it, and it's gone. And then... But, yeah, usually what happens is, if it lives... then the collar will fall off. I don't know exactly what happened with this particular individual, but it'll rip off, or it'll slide off if it's a doe, maybe. It just gets real loose and it just degrades to nothing and it'll just fall off. This will never last forever. I mean,
right.
A doe collar is not falling off.
No.
It's going to be, that's its necklace for life.
Were you ever able to recapture a deer that had an active fawn collar on it and recollar it?
Yes, and recollar it and put one of these on. Yeah. And
okay.
It didn't happen a ton, but yeah,
okay.
It did. It
cool.
did.
I mean, that's like a ton of data then on a single deer.
That is cool. That's when you basically you get its entire life. And because you normally can't do that, you're sort of piecing it together through these different deer, these different segments of their lives, and you're kind of piecing it together. But that's the cool part, is when you can get the whole thing for sure. Yeah. The one cool extra thing about the GPS collars, because they're GPS collars, this is to find it, you've got to have, this is like a little radio station hanging from its neck, and you've got to have a special antenna that's tuned to the right radio station, and you got to be close enough and pointed your antenna at it. So to know what's happening, you have to be out there. And so, like, I should say too, like, if a fawn dies or the collar comes off and it's motionless for a period of time, there's a little switch in here, and that switch will get activated, and then the beep rate changes. So if you were to tune into this radio station, when it's on a fawn walking around, it'll go beep, 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 and then if it's dead, then it's going to go beep, 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 and then it'll pause and give us like a code that actually gives us the timestamp of when it went.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's cool, and that's how that works, but you have to someone has to be searching for it, and you can lose them. It's possible. With the GPS collars, though, I mean, it's like these deer are just carrying a GPS and just doing a waypoint every several hours and then emailing them to you and stuff, and that's cool. You get a huge volume of information, and the location information is super high quality.
When will we see these at retail, Dan?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, and they probably have. I mean, they have like analogs for these for your dogs and cats now, I think.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
But yeah. So the cool thing is, and then what happens too with these, and so it's getting these GPS locations, and then it's transmitting them, and then we can go like see where the deer was, with some lag of 12 to 24 hours basically. But when the collar becomes motionless, just like this changes the beep rate, this sends us a text message and an email and saying, hey, you're and it gives a blast of locations, and it says, your collar is motionless, probably means your deer died, and here's where it was, and here's when it happened. So then that enabled us to get to deer really quickly, the dead deer really quickly. Usually, I mean, if there's sometimes like if a deer kind of dies on top of the collar, and it might affect the ability of the collar to transmit, or if we couldn't get permission. But so there are instances where we couldn't get to them right away, but usually this technology allows us to get to those carcasses, those dead deer, really quickly, which allows us to get more higher quality information, better figure out what's going on with that individual. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool. No, that is awesome. How many total deer did you guys capture?
So
what year did the study start?
Yeah.
And then how many deer did you capture over that time period?
Our first deer was collared in 2017, so it's been a while, and we collared through 2020. So we wrapped up our adult collaring right before COVID shut down. And we collared fawns we collared adult deer for 4 winters, and we were going to collar fawns for 4 springs, but then we couldn't do that final COVID year.
Gotcha.
So we got 3 years of fawn collaring, but in total we collared like a little over 1,000 deer, and it was a little over 300 fawns and over 700 adult deer.
Wow, it's a lot of deer.
It's a lot of deer. Yeah, it's a ton of work. A lot of people involved, and a lot of, again, like the permissions, the access we had from landowners was amazing. I mean, it didn't limit us at all in what we could do. We had a lot of great access. It was yeah.
I mean, to my knowledge, and another thing that I think is notably significant, this is the largest study of its kind, yes?
Well, it's certainly one of them. I mean, it's probably the largest. I mean, it's among the largest in terms of just like deer collared. It's probably the largest that focused on CWD in terms of deer collared. Yeah. So it was a big effort for sure.
What did we find out about these collared deer?
Yeah, I mean, a tremendous amount. And we are still learning things. And we've got all kinds of analyses on like buck movement and habitat use of these deer and all this cool stuff. The main finding, what I consider to be the most important finding of it all, is just showing those difference in the mortality rates between infected deer and uninfected deer. And so to me, that's the most important finding. And so what we found is for uninfected does, so if a doe did not have CWD, her survival was quite high. Adult does, right? Over 80% annual survival. So if you're alive, if a 2-year-old doe is alive on January 1st and she doesn't get CWD, the chance that she's alive on December 31st is like 83%, right? If she had CWD, her chance is like 40%. So there's a huge reduction in annual survival of infected does. And with bucks, it's even more dramatic. And so with bucks, again, it's kind of the same thing. If you're a 2-year-old buck alive on January 1st and you don't have CWD, you've got like nearly a 70% chance of surviving the year. That's really high. That's really high. I should say these are fully huntable populations.
Yeah, with I'd say a pretty aggressive season structure.
And as aggressive season structure as can be, basically, in our framework. And with bucks, though, in that a 70% annual survival is very, very high. But if it's got CWD, if the buck has CWD, then the survival is like less than 20%.
Wow.
So there's a huge reduction in buck survival based on having CWD.
Is that speculation due to just that they run harder and they rut and they run themselves down and they're more susceptible to the CWD, or why would their survival rate be lower?
Well, good question. So there's two bits to that.
I guess ultimately it's fatal.
Yes.
But
yeah. So and one thing is that bucks have a higher prevalence rate than does in almost any population you see. Just that's usually how it goes. And there's a variety of reasons for that, which we don't fully know, but we suspect there's behavioral differences between bucks and does that make bucks more at risk for getting CWD. So CWD deer have higher risk of getting CWD. But then once they have CWD, then they've got a higher risk of dying. But they have a higher risk of dying, like from everything than does, kind of no matter what, principally from hunting. That's the main difference, is that there's a higher harvest rate on bucks than does. But yeah, I mean, but CWD is having a huge impact on the survival of both deer for sure.
Is there speculation that some of those, because bucks, I'd say by and large, are targeted by hunters, is there speculation that some of those bucks with CWD are losing their wits a little bit and becoming harvested? Not as
they're just not as, I mean, it's a neurological disease, and so they've got to be at some level become less and less aware, and exactly how. Actually, I should say another cool aspect of this study that kind of informs this is that we've begun to look at the difference in movement characteristics between deer that have CWD and deer that don't. So we're taking, okay, we know all these deer, it had CWD and it died on this date. We have that for a whole bunch of deer. And then you can look back through time before it died and then compare at the same period of time a deer that didn't have CWD and how did their movements differ. And so we see that CWD is changing their movement rates months before they actually die, and it's making them move less. We can't, through the GPS collars, you can't really measure, like, are they less aware or whatever, but you can look at their movement characteristics and you can see that they're moving less. That's the principal thing, months before they die. Which is interesting about that is those movement changes occur before outward physical changes. Okay? So if you have this picture in your head of a CWD deer and we show those wasting pictures where that's super emaciated and like drooping head and their ears are down and they're drooling, that's what they look like at the end. But that's only at the end, right? And we've collared a bunch of deer that look totally healthy. And then 6 weeks later, 8 weeks later, whatever, they are just completely emaciated. So losing 50 pounds in 2 months or less.
Wow, that's rapid.
Or less. It's incredibly rapid. So that goes to the kind of the cascade of effects. So they're infected for some period of time. I don't know how long. They probably wouldn't know. Like they're not different. At some point, they start to act differently in some subtle and then less and less subtle ways. Like I said, we can pick up differences in movement like 4 or 5 months prior to death, but then it's the last several weeks where their body condition, where they outwardly look sick to us. That's kind of how that sequence works.
Incredible. Yeah, I wonder too, like having this knowledge now and then being able to track one of these GPS collared deer, you could almost predict by movement, like, oh, this deer is moving a lot less, like high probability that it is at that stage.
That's a great point. I think if we were to, like, say if we had cause to collar deer again, I think that might be possible to actually look at what we learned through here and start to detect, okay, this deer is really, it's moving way less than average. It's just not moving like a quote unquote normal deer. So it's probably has CWD. Yeah, I think it's entirely possible with that sort of data. Yeah.
When it comes to populations as a whole and prevalence, how does that relationship come into play?
Yeah. So with the level of mortality that we see, the level of reduction in mortality that CWD presents, when you put that, kind of plug that into a population model with recruitment, with what we know from pregnancy rates and fawn survival rates, and then the how CWD reduces adult deer survival, and you can sort of build this relationship to say, okay, well, if your prevalence is at this rate, what's the reduction in population change? If it's at this rate, what's the reduction? What point does CWD or does prevalence get high enough where you would actually expect your population to decline? And so we can do that, and we did do that. So from our modeling with this data that we've collected, we would predict that around 29% prevalence is the sort of break-even point. And if your prevalence is higher than that, if your prevalence of adult females is in the 30s or higher, then we would expect your deer populations likely decreasing because of the effects of CWD on deer survival. So there are areas in southern Wisconsin where adult female prevalence is currently above that threshold. So there's areas that the deer population should be declining. We've certainly heard that plenty from hunters and landowners in certain areas. It's not like going to be uniform. So you're not going to look at like an entire county necessarily. I mean, there's going to be areas, prevalence varies a lot. There's some areas that maybe for whatever reason they've got higher productivity, they got better recruitment, maybe that they're not as harmed, but probably not. That's probably not a huge variable, but it's possible. But yeah, so I think we're in a mode in these highest prevalence areas in Wisconsin where, again, they may have very well have been seeing it the last few years, but we should be expecting declining deer population, fewer deer than that they're used to because of CWD.
And what about by the way the nature of the disease works? What might or what are thoughts on like age class structure? Like the longer a deer is on the landscape, the higher probability it has to get CWD. Like, will we get to a point where, like, oh man, a 3-year-old buck, that's an old buck, or a 2-year-old buck, that's an old buck?
I think because of there's more than just CWD, because there's also harvest rates,
right?
And what's getting harvested that doesn't have CWD. So if you like average the high survival of deer that don't have CWD with the low survival of deer that do, you get certainly a higher mortality rate and therefore a lower buck age structure than you would if you didn't have CWD, for sure. So relative to the condition of not having CWD, yeah, you're going to have a younger deer herd. But you still can have deer, you can still get some old deer. You'll have fewer of them because there's always, think of it this way. Deer can skate by. For one thing, if you say you flip a coin 5 times, you're not likely to, and say every time you flip a coin, that's a heads you live, tails you die. If you flip it 5 times, you could get 5 heads in a row. So there's deer that even just through chance will not get it, CWD. And so or they'll just get it later if they get it as a 3-year-old. That's not going to probably kill them until they're after like 4 or 5. So there's going to be deer. There's going to be some old deer. And if you compare it to in Wisconsin in like the 80s, 70s earlier, we used to hammer bucks like in a totally different way. Mm-hmm. Like we had units and years where we were killing 80-90% of the antlered bucks every year. Wow. Like legit. So the sort of mature buck scenario compared to that history is in some sense better, I guess, just because we're not killing bucks that way anymore. We're killing far fewer fewer deer. People are way more selective. So it's like complicated. So yes, CWD is going to cause a younger age structure than if you didn't have CWD. But I do think you're still going to have some old bucks around. You're never going to like lose them entirely. There's a good chance they'll be infected though.
Gotcha.
Yeah, at least probably if you're in the highest prevalence area, a good coin flip that they'll be
right. Right. Is there any difference in prevalence? Like I think of like maybe because you have different factors at play, at least the way I'm thinking about this, but you've got maybe like a highly managed piece of of private land where minimal pressure, people are like by and large leaving it alone, right? But maybe you have a higher population of deer on that piece of property versus let's say a piece of public land. You have people using that piece of public land for a variety of activities. You have access by anybody in the public who has a valid hunting license during any of the open hunting seasons, which essentially in Wisconsin that's mid-September through potentially the end of January. On those public pieces, you're going to have a lot of people pushing deer around, moving deer around, potentially spreading CWD, I guess, in some ways. Or is there any difference there between public and private?
The biggest difference is probably in the harvest rate. And so that leaving things alone, if that means you're not shooting many deer, that's compared to the public, which they obviously are shooting more deer, that is the key difference. And from a CWD perspective, the public land where the harvest rate is higher is like better because the main sort of management prescription is increasing harvest to manage CWD. And the reason there's a few reasons. One is if you think about a deer, again, say it's infected for 18 months. Let's say there's some chance, think of it like every week there's a chance that infected deer could infect another deer. They just got a per week chance. How do you reduce the chances that it infects another deer? You give it fewer weeks to live. So you want to shorten the lives of infected deer because that reduces their opportunities to spread the disease. The disease spreads when, on average, an infected deer infects more than one deer. That's how it works. And if it infects, on average, less than one deer, the disease will diminish. So that's the biggest thing, is you just make the lives of infected deer shorter. How it also does that, especially if you're disposing of those infected carcasses, like putting them in the dumpsters, they're going more into the waste stream rather than just like out on the landscape, then you're reducing the prion load in the environment. Well, you're also, by shortening their life, there's fewer infected poop and drool and whatever else. But anyway, so you're removing that infected carcass from the landscape compared to whether it lived its full infectious lifespan, tipped over on the land, and now the prions are there. And then thirdly is there's probably some impact of just having fewer deer and having them just be less contacting one another. Right?
Sure.
So if there's a lot of deer, there's going to be some increase in the amount of contacts. If you are effectively lowering the deer population, you're going to reduce that. But the main thing, I think the thing to focus on is like, let's give these infected deer the least amount of chances. And so the public land, back to your kind of comparison, if you're on public land, I mean, those in our farmland, especially compared to private land, there's a lot more harvest per acre. Harvest per square mile is much higher on our farmland, public lands than it is on our private land. So, but from a CWD standpoint, that's good. So if you're like, I leave it alone and we're not shooting on does, and you're only going to shoot, you're just going to shoot, wait till you get the biggest buck. I mean, that's, especially the doe harvest, you're just letting more, you're having more deer out there. You're letting the disease kill the deer instead of you killing the deer. So from a CWD standpoint, having a really light touch on a property is probably not, from a harvest standpoint, is not helpful.
Have you guys, or has there been any testing done on, like, we have predators on the landscape. I know predators were part of the study, but like, Has CWD ever been found like present in an animal that's not necessarily affected by it though? Like
You mean a deer or another animal?
like a coyote, let's say.
So
Like it's not killing the coyote.
It's
It's
not
not having negative effects, but like it's in it.
So no, to our knowledge, whenever someone has like looked at coyote brains or raccoon brains or whatever, they're not finding CWD. Not that that's been done a ton, but to my knowledge, yeah, that's not happening. They are consuming infected deer, obviously, and they're pooping it out. So we've seen that. So you can get coyote poop.
Oh, okay.
And detect prions in it.
Okay.
That's we've done that in Wisconsin, yeah.
And they're not, going through the digestive tract and being neutralized. They're
that's a great question. So there's been some work. So it's not fully, but there's been some work like with bobcats, at least, that shows that the prion load is diminished. So whatever they're ingesting, they're pooping out less.
okay.
So there's probably so how does that differ between the different animals that eat deer, between like an eagle, a vulture, a raccoon, a coyote, a bobcat, whatever? How do those differ between those different animals? I don't know. I don't think we know that yet. So there is some, but at least from that one study, there's a diminishment as it goes through the guts, but it's not like getting rid of it totally. So actually at UW-Madison right now, there's a study that we've got going on where, because we collared coyotes and bobcats, and the graduate student is looking at, well, how much, because we've got work showing, you put camera on a deer and you see what visits it, but like, okay, thinking about how much a coyote moves during during the gut passage time, right? So you eat something, it takes a certain amount of time for it to pass, right? How much can they move in that period? And do they move certain areas? And so if there's a potential for spread from that activity, well, what is that likelihood? What does that look like? And so there's a student working on that.
Cool.
Right now. Yeah.
Very interesting. Very interesting. What, when it comes to the study, like what is the prediction of what our deer herds will look like? And maybe we're there right now. Maybe that's where, like you said, some areas have kind of like leveled off, like they have a high prevalence, but they've leveled off to a degree. Like, what do we predict that will look like? And then, early on in the conversation, we talked about, at one time we were having pretty aggressive management. Will there be recommendations based off this study that will, impact how we, our season structures and how we harvest deer and what's recommended there?
Yeah. So to the first question about like what's going to happen with the deer herd, and so where we have like around here where CWD prevalence is high, and what we've seen again, like I said, is the prevalence is seemingly not going up anymore, at least. So we're probably at what it's going to be in terms of the prevalence. Again, I can't say things wouldn't change in the future because it's just a weird system, but I do think we'll lose deer. Now beyond what we've got, to what level, I don't know. There's a lot of unknowns. Like, so how will the disease respond to fewer deer? Will we actually see a reduction in transmission as the deer population diminishes? Maybe, maybe not. And then the other question is, how does the deer population, especially on the recruitment side, respond to the reduction in deer numbers? Because what likely will happen is fawn pregnancy rates. So like when a fawn can get pregnant if they're big enough, like meaning give birth on their first birthday. In southern Wisconsin in the 80s, we did my predecessors did a study on roadkill deer, and 50% of fawns were getting pregnant.
Wow.
That is an indication of the deer numbers relative to the habitat were great. We had good habitat and that we weren't like overpopulated. Nowadays, and I redid this study when I came to the DNR, and nowadays we're talking like, shoot, less than 20% fawn pregnancy rate. So our recruitment, and we've seen that in our fawn to doe ratio, our recruitment's gotten lower mostly, and not just in where there's CWD, but across a lot of our farmland. A lot probably because of competition for to make it sort of oversimplified, overpopulation, competition for food. All right, so as the deer population from CWD goes down, what should happen is there's more food available to those that are left over. So those should have some better condition. I would knock on wood, expect some increase in recruitment based on better conditions. So maybe earlier fawn breeding, stuff like that. So that would put more fawns on the landscape per deer out there. That should help buffer against CWD. So all that is to say, I don't know where it's going to is it going to level out somewhere? I don't know. I don't know where it's going to go. We're not going to lose deer. I'm confident in that. But we're going to have, hunters should expect fewer deer than they are used to. And I think a lot of they're already seeing that and saying that.
I've heard that just, obviously working here at Vortex, where a lot of hunters here, we talk with a lot of hunters, and there's a bit of a consensus there for sure.
Yeah. And then the other question is, well, so like if you're in a different part of the country or the state where CWD is new, then you should have an eye on, okay, what's going to happen here? Can you do something different? Because the likely scenario is if you've got CWD, we've never seen almost every case. If you've got CWD, what happens is it increases in prevalence. When if it's going to increase to 30% or more in adult females, you're going to see a reduction in your deer population. That's just what's going to happen. So that's, the future I can't say exactly, but like that's the general future is fewer deer, sicker deer, frankly. And just, yeah. So, and then you asked about how that might change management.
Yeah. I mean, do we need to at least take a look? And I don't know the answer to this. And I'll say this. Back in the day, I fell in the camp. I was like, yo, Wisconsin is being really, really hard on its does. And now I'm like, oh, maybe we should have kept doing that. And now it's like, well, do we need to take a look back at that for overall population health? And I don't know that answer.
Yeah, I mean, how we were able to achieve the high doe harvest that we did achieve, which I think in Iowa County, it was as high as, if I'm just as off the top of my head, as high as like 9 antlerless deer per square mile removed on average. That's a lot of deer. Now it's like 2. So we're not shooting nearly the does that we used to. And after that, but that was a particular set of regulations that we had, the Ernebuck. We don't have that. As soon as those regulations went away, we were shooting like 4 does per square mile. And that was not enough to keep the population from going up. Well, we can't go back to Ernebuck in Wisconsin. That's not an option unless the legislation changes. And obviously that's their legislature's prerogative. So we're not going to go back to that through regulations. And if you're in a county, say, that maybe doesn't have CWD or has low levels of CWD and you want to do something about it, the regulatory environment's like not favorable because we're already in a lot of these farmland counties in Wisconsin giving 4 free tags or 3 free tags. The DNR is not limiting doe harvest in the farmland. It's the hunters. It's through what does the hunter want to harvest? That's what's limiting the number of hunters and the desire of the hunters that we have to harvest does. That determines our antlerless harvest, and we can't. That's not a rope we can push on or whatever, right? Like we can't do it. So we're in Wisconsin. I think we're in a tough spot. We have currently the DNR, Wisconsin DNR, like a lot of states, has this like a CWD plan. We are in the process of reviewing and revising that plan. It's an ongoing process. It's a bit of a public engagement process, and that process, plan, team, and whatever, has access to these results and can, make recommendations that they think might, use this information. But it's difficult because we're at a scenario, on a statewide and even national level, we're losing deer hunters too. So we're losing the capacity for harvest. So that makes the job, if the main tool is, and it is, like it or not, is harvesting more deer, that job gets tougher and tougher each year.
Sure. Well, and then, I'll follow with this question. I'm like, oh, do we need to take a look back at doing that? But did we miss the opportunity because prevalence did get to this point where, around that 30% mark in the doe population, like, has the train sailed a little bit? Or maybe you can always, again, a lot of factors involved, but like if you pulled that, hey, we need to be aggressive with our doe harvest lever, you could kind of get back to that. Or maybe it's just a simple percentages. I don't know.
Yeah, so we're not going to get rid of CWD, right? Yeah. But if you could wave a magic wand and increase antlerless harvest, that would absolutely help. Even in our highest prevalence areas, I think it would, just because of how it kind of works, like I explained, it would likely reduce prevalence.
Yeah.
And especially, I think there's a lot of good evidence from our early days, from what Illinois has done, that in the areas where prevalence is low, I mean, that's when the time is right.
Time to strike.
So preferably before you have CWD, before you have CWD. But it's obviously just easier to deal with when it's less common. Right. That's what you want. That's exactly what you want. And so if you have the ability to be proactive and be aggressive, that will give you the highest chances of success. And to me, like, you can ask the question, it's fair to ask the question, well, if we can't get rid of CWD, what's the point? But to me, like, it's a lot better situation to have 1 out of 10 deer or 1 out of 20 deer that you harvest be positive than 1 out of 3. Which would you rather have, right? So I think there's reasons to want to actually, be proactive with management other than eradication, because I think I hear that sometimes. If you can't eradicate it, then just give up. Who cares? But I think it's not that simple. I think you can work to improve the situation kind of across the gradient. That's what you want to do, I think.
Yeah. Huge study. You guys aren't done analyzing the data. What things are left that you're really excited to look at?
Yeah, great question. So we're trying to dig more into the survival data and more into what is our survival data tell us about, more like, how does that give us more detail about the dynamics of our deer herd and CWD since we discovered it? And so, like I talked about, we had our aggressive harvest, and that seemed to suppress CWD growth, and then we stopped. But can we really reconstruct that more fully to get a really detailed picture of, like, well, how does this choice made at this point in time affect the disease and the deer dynamics? That's one big thing, and that's a lot more math and just trying to integrate all the old data we have, because we've collected so much data from the start, from the discovery of CWD, with this more recent collaring data. And then with that, can we do more on the prediction side, forecasting side, knowing more about how the disease dynamics interact with the deer herd dynamics, and then what's the most likely to happen, and then being able to play more, do a better job of playing at the what if games. Well, what if we increase harvest by this much? How would that change the CWD trajectory? So it's like trying to take this data that we collected, really intensely over this period of time, seeing what does it tell us about the past and what can it tell us about the future. That's where I see that's our sort of next steps with this data.
Well, and I would have to imagine, I'm not a deer researcher, but there are things that we could learn from this type of research and the results that you could extrapolate if potentially, let's say, something new hit the landscape and we're like, oh my gosh, we're aware of this new. Maybe it's not something that even affects deer. Maybe it affects something else. It's like, well, we played it this way this time. We saw this. We learned that. Maybe that could inform future decisions with other things.
Yeah, sure. That's a good point. I mean, it's always good to kind of keep an open mind and try to learn, because there's so many. I mean, well, that's how it worked. Like this CWD was, no one knew about it, and then all of a sudden it was a huge fact of life. That happens. And the diseases are where that is likely to come. Diseases, invasive species, they're those things where what are you talking about to all of a sudden it's what you have to deal with. And so, yeah, there's got to be lessons that can be applied, lessons we learn here from not just like the biology side, but also the social side. How is the disease managed, and the social reaction to that definitely would inform the next, if God forbid some other thing came along that we had to deal with, for sure. So yeah, that's a good point.
Any future studies that are on the horizon that you guys are going to be conducting, or is this dude, we got our hands full?
Yeah, I think
this one.
I think we still got our hands full on trying to squeeze as much out as we can out of this, and we'll sort of, research always leads to new questions and new directions, and then, okay, now what? And then, you take your findings to the public and to the policymakers, and they say, oh, okay, well, now you should do this. And so what's next beyond continuing the analysis? I don't know yet. And so we're doing a lot of other stuff. We're doing a lot of deer research in Wisconsin that's got nothing to do with CWD. But in terms of what's next with this, it's, like you said, I got my hands full for now.
We didn't touch on the predator component of this. Is that something you guys are still, is that a step 2 or?
I don't think so, just because there's not a lot of pressing management needs there. We collared coyotes and we collared bobcats, and a lot of that was, well, how do they interact with deer of the varying ages and whatnot. And there was also special interest in bobcats because it was newly, the harvest of bobcats was new at the time, and bobcats are a little bit of a later entrant to that area. They had been extirpated, came back. Anyhow, I think with coyotes, we don't really manage coyotes necessarily. There's not management decisions there. I think we've learned what we need to learn. And with bobcats, I think my understanding is we're a pretty good state there. So I don't anticipate more on that. But again, we as researchers, we respond to the interest from our management partners and the public. So it could be the case that next year, we're doing a big bobcat study. Who knows? I don't know. It depends on what pops up. But there's more to be published. We're working on publishing more research from those data.
Okay, I think that's what I was more getting.
Yeah. At. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So because we've done a lot of that, but staff turnover and other priorities, a lot of that has languished. We published one paper on coyote survival, and we've got more coming out with bobcat survival. Comparing, we've got Southwest, the bobcats collared here, but also we had bobcats collared up north, and so there's some really cool comparisons there to be made. And a lot of that habitat use, movement stuff. We've done a lot of that with deer. We published a lot on movements of deer, but we're doing the same thing with coyotes and bobcats. We're working on that now.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, maybe we'll have to get you back on, and once you guys publish that, and,
sure.
and we can dive into some of that data as well. And speaking of published, all of what we talked about today, like, it is published on the DNR website. I mean, they're like, if a person wants to find out more or dive deeper, or read about what we talked about today. I mean, you guys have a wealth of information that you guys published there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can just go on the deer in our website and type in like deer research, CWD research, or whatever, and you could find all this stuff. We've got many articles going over lots of our findings, and we're continuing to do that. So we'll continue to do that for the foreseeable future. So yeah, it's easy to find more information about what we got going on.
Awesome, man. Well, hey, thank you so much for coming down to join us today. I mean, you've been living up to your name. We actually had this podcast scheduled a few weeks ago. Big snowstorm came in. We almost had some weather today. It was a little bit iffy, but you made it down, so we appreciate it. Tons of great information. Thank you for doing the research. Very important issue, affecting a deer and everybody who cares about deer. So, yeah, thank you for doing that. And, everybody out there, hopefully enjoyed this one. Lots of stuff to digest here, and always interesting.
Thank you.
So, all right, everybody, we'll catch you on the next one. Bye.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.